Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the October 2022 session of Writers at Home, the reading series of UNCA, the Great Smokies Writing Program, and graciously hosted by Malaprops. My name is Lily Danzas. I'm the admin assistant for Great Smokies, and it's so nice to see you all coming out to support some of our wonderful local poets. I'm sure you're all excited, so I'll try and keep my opening remarks short. Today's reading is special for several reasons. For starters, this is our first in-person hybrid reading since the start of the pandemic. So yeah, round of applause. We've been so grateful to Malaprops, in particular, the wizards behind the curtain. That's Stephanie Jones-Byrne, you just heard from, Katie Brown-Long, and Patricia Furnish for their flexibility and ingenuity in keeping our reading series going through the pandemic with virtual live stream readings. So one more round of applause for Stephanie, Patricia, Katie, and the Malaprop team. So the other reason today's reading is so special is because we'll get to hear from two amazing poets, both of whom have had collections published this year, Eric Nelson and Ken Chamlee. The Great Smokies are, oh yeah, we can go, all right, one more. Great Smokies has been incredibly lucky to have had Eric and Ken on our faculty. So quick show of hands, how many of you had a class with Eric or Ken? Yeah, we got some of you, okay. It's so fun to see it's so fun to see the impact of our local writers on the community. So it's my honor to formally introduce them today. It sounds like a lot of you already know them, but Eric Nelson taught writing and literature for 26 years at Georgia Southern University, where he received the Ruffin Cup in 2009 for sustained excellence in teaching, publishing, and service. He retired professor emeritus in 2015 and moved to Asheville. His 6 previous poetry collections include Terrestrials, chosen by Maxine Kumin for the X.J. Kennedy Award, The Interpretation of Waking Life, winner of the University of Arkansas Poetry Award, and Some Wonder, which won the 2015 Gival Press Poetry Award. His most recent collection is Horse Not Zebra, published in April of this year. And Ken Chamlee holds a PhD in English creative writing from UNC Greensboro and is emeritus professor of English at Brevard College. He was the first director of the Looking Glass Rock Writers Conference in Brevard and has served as a Gilbert Chapel Distinguished Poet with the North Carolina Poetry Society. His poems have appeared in the North Carolina Literary Review, Cold Mountain Review, Worcester Review, Naugatuck River Review, and Weber, Contemporary West, and many others, including several editions of Cackalack and Anthology of Carolina Poets. He has also published 2 award-winning chapbooks, Absolute Faith and Logic of the Lost. His most recent collection is If Not These Things, published in August of this year. So Eric and Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn things over to you.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you, Lily.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lily and Stephanie and Malaprops. Thank all of you. I want to just sort of continue what Lily was saying about the Great Smokies Writing Program. It's an amazing program, which I discovered when I moved up here. I don't think there's anything quite like it anywhere else, at least not that I know of. It offers these continuously wonderful classes in different writing genres. So it's a great program. I hope it keeps going for a long, long, long time. I want to put in a plug for the class I'm teaching next semester. And it's going to be centered around Padraig Otuma's forthcoming anthology, Poetry Unbound. You may know him through Krista Tippett's On Being program. He's a good poet himself. He picks great poems. There's 50 poems in this anthology, and then he writes a short essay about each one of them. And his essays are always very insightful and enlightening. So we're going to use that book, and that book will sort of be the basis from which the workshop grows, which I'm very originally calling Workshop Unbound. So. You want to say something about the format that we're using here instead of a traditional reading?
Yeah, instead of doing a stand up, him at the podium, me at the podium, we discovered after Lily had proposed this idea back in the summer and looking at each other's books, we have a rather incredible number of poems that pair off with each other in terms of subject matter, theme, and other things like that. And I'd send him 3, and then he'd send me 3, and then we ended up with probably 12 or 14 poems that work between his book or his books and my book. For mercy's sake, we're not going to read all of those pairs. We've picked a few in a general order of humor to serious to hope and reconciliation and that sort of thing. The kind of way you would structure a book, and the way that I think both of us would structure a reading if it was on our own to do that. You move an audience with you. So we've just had fun with the dialogue back and forth via computer in choosing these pairs, and we're keeping it spontaneous. In the last 5 minutes, we've decided which ones we're going to do. So we're just going to be going back and forth that way.
Yep.
Let me start with it. So since we are reading in a bookstore, we're going to read 2 poems about books and libraries. And also the poem I'm reading has sort of a seasonal tour with it too, which seems appropriate for the beautiful season that we're in right now. So in honor to Malaprops and to Great Smokies, 2 poems about books. Hardcover editions. The silver maple in our yard writes a new book every year. First, a few green words and twiggy phrases, then manifold paragraphs in leafy effusion. Other writers show up too. Along the road, white pines straight as solemn scribes obsess over 5s, fingering needle clusters like tracks on the Pentateuch or the Pillars of Islam. The flamboyant mimosa arrives late, tossing pink blooms like a manic flower girl. Quick and fussy in the high branches, hummingbird acolytes defend her overwritten frills. Unlike some novelists, the maple knows when its draft is complete, leaf count met, and even midsummer begins shedding minor characters and unreached themes, an unsparing edit lasting weeks, brittle pages piled with culls of other writers who mill the winter in drab coats, mulling sequels.
That idea of trees as books, because trees kind of get turned into books.
Yeah.
And also that it goes all through the seasons, and takes us to the end, and then starts mulling the sequel for the next season. Nice. So my book poem is called Perfect Work. I don't think it needs too much explanation, so I'll just dive right in. Perfect work. When I consider how my working life's been spent, I think fondly of driving the Floyd County bookmobile, an old school bus refitted with rows of shelves and a built-in desk behind the driver's seat so I could swivel smoothly from driver to librarian. I see myself gripping the wheel, chugging narrow mountain roads, navigating hairpins to the parking lot of Andy's Summit Mart, where they wait. 3 or 4 kids running around, grandmas smoking and shouting at the kids to settle, and the wiry man in the tractor cap off to one side, like he may or may not be here to browse the war books. I always hesitate before opening the door, a pause to let everyone, including me, absorb the marvel before us, a movable feast, other worlds on wheels, 3 steps above the top of the towering mountain. Now, when I slouch into my office down on the world or myself, especially the days I don't think I can stand one more stab at my work, I imagine the bookmobile crossing the New River through clouds, past meadows and pastures, cows as my witness, my heavy cargo leaning back, me leaning forward, looking for the parking lot, shining in the sun like a small lake. How I wish I had gotten that job. Never thankless or boring, never less than fulfilling. best jobs are the ones that you don't actually have.
Oh, okay. An experience that most of the people in this room, judging by age, probably had was posing for pictures for yearbooks or school photos and things like that. Something you don't see done anymore. Now the students are they've got everything posted on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. So you don't get to go and put yourself in front of a photographer. We discovered that we both have poems about doing that very thing. But as you would expect, two radically different takes on the experience. Who wants to go first on this one?
You want me to?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay. And mine's called Picture Day. And we all remember, right? We remember from our kids having Picture Day. All morning, under warning, they stayed unstained, pressed and brushed, waiting for their moment to be petrified. Deposing over, hungry and free, they swarm the lunchroom with clacking trays, unwrapping themselves, spilling soup and milk, talking with their mouths full of missing teeth. The photographer, all coos and chuckles earlier, lugs his equipment out the door. The children settle into steady eating and murmuring, ignoring the sobs of the boy in the middle of the row, staring at his tray, his tears dripping. He always cries every day, cried as his picture was made. A teacher rubs his back, whispers to him, and reminds the others not to pass the napkins. They know he will shred and scatter like feathers. When the bell rings, they rise, awkward as baby birds, hair wild, ribbons undone, shirts unfurled and wrinkled as the brown bags they drop into the trash before they sleepwalk, single file to their rooms. Only the one who weeps remains unchanged, his white shirt still stiff, black pants still creased, hair in place.
his experience is the aftermath of Picture Day for the children. Mine is prior to getting the picture made from the perspective of an adult, because the faculty were always called in to pose for pictures along with all the students, right? This happened for years and years and years until all of a sudden it never happened again, right? The title of this poem is a quote from an Eliot poem you may recognize. A face to meet the faces. When did photographers first serve cheese to draw their subjects' lips like a theater curtain, as if the pose had just seen a pratfalling drunk or a pie plopped in the face of a well-dressed lady? In the old tintypes, pioneers sit stiff as cornstalks, their best clothes still shabby, their faces pinched and blasted as the scrabbled land, indifferent behind the backdrop sheet. Today, heritage is a carnival sepia and a stenciled mat, a woman floozed out in a feather boa and a saloon skirt, her man leathered up in cartridge belts, a Pancho Villa mustache and a dangerous hat. In the studio, the photographer offers me scrims of unearned lives, a parlor bookcase, apple blossoms shading a rail fence, a turquoise lagoon where a palm tree leans in like a lover. Even basic poses are contortions, knees west, face east, eyes up, chin down, head cocked like a happy spaniel. He touches a chord to my nose, exact distance to my flaws. Lightning flashes in the silver umbrellas. Posed and poseur, I bare my polished teeth.
Well, there was the Happy Spaniel reference in that poem. So, and we discovered that we both have a lot of poems about dogs. And so we thought we needed to read at least one dog poem each. So I'm going to read a poem called Good Dog, This is not for my current dog, but a previous dog.
Got to work up to that, right?
Yeah. So this is for Molly, our golden retriever. Wonderful dog. Good dog. When I walk the dog, I let the dog decide where we go. I keep the leash loose and follow in her footsteps to the busy street that scares us both. But it's the only way to the grand tree at the corner where she stands in a trance, her nose vacuuming the bulging roots for a snootful of who knows what. Or she heads the other way to the empty lot, a minefield of turds I step through gingerly while she throws herself on the foulest ones and spins like a washing machine, then trots to the puddle by the curb and takes a long drink, lapping it up like champagne, splashing as if it were the fountain of puppyhood. Her shanks and feathers drenched, she looks at me as if I envy her and seems to say, okay, I'm good and wet and camouflaged in the scent of excrement. Let's go home and I'll slip beneath your desk into a dream of running squirrels into trees while you take the heat for letting me get into everything.
It's funny how dogs do seek out the foulest things to express their individuality and bring it home with you. But for the most part, the Westminster Dog Show excluded, most dogs don't possess a sense of vanity. They just do what they want to do and exercise themselves. They accommodate themselves to us in our civilization, but every now and then they've got those primal urges. New song. Asphalt shimmers, curves to woods that lean and whisper on days I don't block everything with a helmet of rock and roll. Somebody like the Doors rescinding the petty orders of the day, slamming the mopish yes and the querulous no into a cave that's dark and black and crystalline. Susie trots with me, up the grade and back, into the woods and out. No thought to impress with her 2 miles to every one of mine. The road's edge is her world, wet black leaves and a sorority of smells, ears cocked like a pair of sevens, ready to charge the laurel on a squirrel's dare or to sack the green village of sparrows. I'm pushing palm against thigh when Susie takes off over the hill right as Ray Manzarek takes off on the organ interlude of Light My Fire. He works and reworks the same plane of notes, stair steps down, then back up before teasing into Krieger's lyrical Eastern guitar. It's the way love pulls you toward a silver wall, lifts you to a bright, airless zone where you will gladly trade breath for one more tenuous moment. When I meet my dog on the downslope, she is writhing in the weeds by the runoff ditch, legs pedaling, growling the low guttural of joy. She whips upright, shakes pointlessly as I speak, but I can't hear my voice above the new song rising in my ears. She noses my hand, then lopes up the road, whirling and snapping at bees. Yeah, we may be close to the same age. I don't even really.
Probably are. We have the same facial hair, same everything. It's scary.
It's scary. So we have poems about aging as well, but the reason I mentioned that is we both had poems about playing war as young boys, which I think was a very 1950s.
60s, please.
60s, okay. Told you. Thing to do. Influenced by no doubt TV shows, you remember there was a slew of Westerns and a slew of combat shows and things, all of which were a little less violently pitched than the things that you see now. But we thought we would read those poems about our experience playing serious war games as kids and so forth. Mine is called Playing Death. When blackbirds, cherry drunk in spring, splattered our drying wash, we played out in the backyard and died. The purplish berries were no good for eating, unlike the red eye bites our parents speared in drinks. So we slapped handfuls of gore to t-shirts, fought in storied battles. Twin pines were Samson's pillars, the dog Delilah. We were dropped in the cold sand in Normandy, hacked by Roman swords made from stilts, then clocked by a Black Knight's tetherball mace. We dropped off stepladder cliffs into grass seas, fell to muskets, revolvers, submachine brooms, Apache lances, and arcs of longbow arrows. Our death throes were precise and graceful, overlapped hands to the heart, spine arched, knees sagging in a spiral collapse, a yodeled scream, the grimace without pain. We lingered in eloquence, brave farewells for fallen comrades. Smiles flicked across the masks of our repose, and we bounced up, scrambling to the jet swings, bloodless and bloody, lifting away from scuffed earth.
It really is remarkable how similar our poems are, and I guess our experiences were. We might have been playing the same battles. Yeah. So mine is called Our Wars, and it seems really, not very surprising that we continue to have wars, because when you start little boys fighting wars, when they're young, they just seem to keep at it. Our wars. He was a nerd before there were nerds, but one thing you had to say for Mark, the guy knew how to die. In our wars, he was the first to scream, "I'm hit!" Tumble, sprawl, pitch forward, face first, call mama, and go still, not flinching the gnats from his eyes, because this was death, and he knew the physics, body in motion, opposite and equal, wherever it takes you. We envied him, we who were afraid to risk a rash, a tear, our mother's wrath. He perfected the staggering collapse, the high-speed tree collide and ricochet, the twirl into prickly vines. D-Day at the beach, knee-deep in surf. We'd barely begun when Mark screamed, clasped his head, and fell into the dead man's float. The rest of us zigzagged through the sound effects, burping guns, whistling missiles, until we made it up the beach to the picnic table, bellowed triumph, took slugs from canteens, and ran toward the smoking grill. When Mark staggered up, dripping, he wanted to know why we hadn't waited for him, if we knew how long he'd held his breath. We didn't look at him. Nobody told him to die. We planned another assault. Yeah.
We both seemed to notice birds and had poems about feeding birds in our book. Where did your interest in birds come from? Mine was from my mother.
I think mine was from birds. I don't know. I don't really know. I can't answer it.
I'm counting not to say. My mother fed birds and loved birds and could identify them. And I guess that just sort of stuck with me. And when I finally had a house where I could hang a feeder and watch them, it was something that I've enjoyed doing. Seed. I hung a red bird feeder under the carport eave, replacing an unwatered fern. No birds came. After I swept away the brown curls and scattered a coaxing trail, 3 doves ruffled out of the mist to bob and peck. Wrens built a nest under my bicycle seat, but nothing drew to the feeder. Even the squirrels ignored it, their bodies and tails scribing cursive hymns as they looped around the yard. This morning, as a coffee maker gurgled and hissed, a hummingbird zipped to the feeder, paused, poured a quick circuit, vanished, returned, touched the needle tray with its beak before I blinked it away. How many times have I tossed chaff instead of seed, poured seed instead of nectar? I stared into the waking yard long enough to watch shadows disown the stacked flower pots and inch away.
So remember when you mentioned hummingbirds, I did remember that probably was my mother. She had a hummingbird feeder she had outside her kitchen window. And also she would sit on the couch in the living room where there was a big window and have her binoculars looking at birds. So I guess it was. Yeah. So mine is called feeders. You can have birds hang from an eave, a feeder filled with seeds. They will find it. The little dusty ones first, sparrows and wrens, and then like flames, cardinals and orioles and warblers, the cool blue flash of jays and buntings, yin yang of chickadees. They'll splash in the seeds and sing in the shower, spill over, rooting below. The air, which seemed both empty and heavy, will vibrate with wing flash and whistle. In the natural light of the window where you reflect, you will feed your hunger for wonder.
Love that wing flash and whistle. That's wonderful.
That's true. Is that one?
How are we doing on time?
We're
Good.
good?
We're good. It's not 5:30 yet.
Okay.
So
All right.
we've got time for Q&A.
Thank you.
All right.
So,
You decided.
more of these then.
Okay, starting here.
Sure, why not? I'll let you introduce that.
Okay. So this is called, my poem is called Graying. And so these poems are about getting older and turning gray. Yeah, so we both have several of those kind of poems also. Oh, this is in this book. Graying. The novelty intrigued at first. A gray hair. Yanked it out, examined, coarser than the brown, crimpy, like a pubic hair that lost its spring and way. As they filled my temples, I thought distinguished. I thought salt and pepper. Little by little, my temples were all salt, my sideburns pillars of it. I thought old. A good friend, who else, said, "You've gone gray so fast." I leaned forward like an old silverback gorilla, pressed my weight onto my knuckles, grunt. In front of the mirror, clear as a stream above the mist, I think, how vain, but I'm thinking of dyeing my hair. It's summer. If it's disaster, I won't have to endure my students' and colleagues' undisguised contempt. I'll stay inside until it grows out. I decide to wait until I return from seeing my dad in Florida. When I pull into the parking lot at the assisted living place where he is dying, a few old men are walking the perimeter, gray heads down, watching their steps, one of them smiling. I run my hand through my hair, check myself in the rear view. I think, this is what happens if you're lucky.
There are two sides to this story, however. Before the fog burns off, what is the good of gray? Death pallor, dullness, the hue of dust, ashes and old age, nothingness. Gray lacks commitment and carries rain. Gray hums neither song nor whistle, the very color of ambivalence. What is the good of gray? An elm's shadow in a snowfield, rain webs and worn silver. Gray mediates and soothes the eye. Gray robes the mountain valleys, the flannel sage of morning.
That's a much nicer way to think of it. I like that. Do you want to do these?
Sure, why not? Yes.
So this seems like it would be predictable that we both have a lot of poems about hiking around in the mountains. So we're going to read a couple of those. And mine is called Switchback. And switchbacks are great in that they make it easier to get up the mountain, but they always seem so weird to me because I think I could go so much faster if I went straight up. And it doesn't feel like you're really making progress. So that's kind of where this poem got started. Switchback, more across than up. We single file the narrow trail, each turn returning us the way we came, not so much ahead or behind as parallel, an Escher sketch that goes both somewhere and nowhere. When we keep alert for bear and deer within the rare old growth forest, we stumble on root flare and outcrop. When we watch our step, we're lashed by branches. We feel the animals watching us pass. A gray cloud seeps down the mountain. We can't tell where one ends and one begins, or if the cry is a hawk or a far siren. And now rain claps the canopy and ferns on both sides of the trail wave us on to the sunlit gauntlet of thorny shrubs covered in white flowers, their sweetness so much like a memory of sweetness. We want to linger, the air drumming with bees, the flowers crawling with them. The bees don't seem to care about us, but we know nothing is straightforward. We move forward in increments, sideways, by reversal, to the summit, more meadow than peak, the wind parting the grasses for the view we climbed for, the valley where we live. So now we get all the way to the top and then we just look back down to our houses.
Again, a different take. True story, based on a location probably within 20 crow miles of here, I would guess. The wilderness experience. Somewhere below the Balsam summit, the trail we followed from the valley is gone. Wide as a boulevard beside our morning camp, it narrowed away from the river, collapsed to a suggestion of ferns, and now has disappeared beneath stump spill and jackstraw trees. The last blaze mark was an hour ago, and cryptic light is slanting across our unshouldered packs. We are lost. When the Puritans sagged to that rocky coast, they did not know the sea of trees before them was as vast as the ocean behind. They knew only their fears, beasts and devils, unimaginable darkness. They hacked graveyards and clearings, roughed out scaffolds and cabins, each acre of ragged stumps a sanctuary. In the deep gloom of rhododendron, I recall how every season someone strays from a mountain trail and dies, someone who did not expect to, and I began to understand the Puritans. I see myself in stiff clothes, swinging an axe against the wall of woods around me, wanting it gone, wanting to be back at the river by a dwindling fire, not pulling myself through heath hells and gullies choked with roots. With the logic of the lost, we grope the way we came, the hardest way, toward what we think we know.
Yeah.
Where are we?
Each of these almost enough. Please stand.
Getting there?
Yep.
All right. We have 2 poems that feature hands, which are both about work or effort, community effort, and that sort of thing. Won't say too much more, but we'll just go with that. This is called Please Stand. Praise to the people who read directions before assembling the bookcase. And praise to the people who don't and say, where does this piece go? Huzzah to lovers of multi-lane freeway, its interposing grass and routine facilities, and hip hip to drivers happy when roadwork shunts them onto a shoulderless byway. We salute all ritual beginnings, green flags and baptisms, the elegant unfolding of napkins. We salute the impulse too, ordering the novel entree or taking an uncleared trail. Hallowed are all humble acts of courage, hands trembling over a keyboard, waving a child off to school, unpacking a suitcase that has just been packed. We honor the private ceremonies of continuance when just getting dressed is a prayer. Honor upon all uncheered miles pedaled or run in the rain. Honor to those who show up, who keep promises made in public, keep the ones silent and heavy as snow. Praise for the rich soil of hope, for the precious seeds, and for hands working, many hands, more than enough.
I love that poem. It is so affirming and praising both the people who read the directions and the people that don't read the directions. It sort of unifies all oppositions. And I love that ending, that it's more than enough. Is that what it says?
Yeah.
Yeah. And mine, not so much. Mine's called Almost Enough. Like that rainy night after poker when Jim backed his car off the driveway into the ditch, and the five of us pushed first from the back, then from the front, then side to side, each time thinking the wheels were about to spin free. When we gave up, the car was stuck deeper in the muck and our shoes were caked. Or when the stone bench caved in after the hurricane washed out the ground beneath it. There were enough of us to right the legs, but when we lifted the granite slab to reseat it, someone's grip slipped and it sank into the soaked ground like a grave marker. There were almost, but not quite enough of us writing letters and calling for swing sets instead of asphalt, parks before parking lots, the woods rather than condos called the woods. Almost enough voted against coal ash pits and pig waste ponds, so hurricanes of the new climate won't sweep ash and shit river by river to the ocean, fish rising up dead as they go. There's almost enough of us to wipe oil from 1,000 gulls before they suffocate. Almost enough to drag dolphins back into water deep enough for them to dive away from us. Almost enough of us to pull the arrows from the eagle's grasp, past the dimmed lamp to the smallest hands. Almost enough to save a bucket at a time this house from burning down.
There's a lot of encouragement as well as challenge in that poem. So getting the signal so we have time for one more pair.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do? Oh, all
Right.
right, very good. So which is first?
I'll do 12th night and then you can finish up, okay?
Okay.
So we decided on this two pairing right sort of at the last minute before the reading began. So I haven't had a chance to read this poem ahead of time to practice at home. So if I mess it up,
Don't blame me.
forgive me. Oh, yes, it's Ken's fault. But I'm glad we came up with this pair because tomorrow is Stephanie and my 42nd anniversary. 42 years of bliss. So this poem is actually about 1 year when it was her birthday. She was born January 6th, which is the Epiphany, the 12th night after Christmas. 12th night. Above the tree line, the Waffle House sign shines brilliantly. No less a beacon than the star 3 kings chased to arrive on the 12th night after the miraculous birth, the night of the birthday of Stephanie. A dozen eggs glow like 12 moons over the grill, where the cook clinks his spatula tune, shoving hash browns into mounds. On the night of the birthday of Stephanie, watching her study the luminous menu, my epiphany occurs. The sky is not the limit. Time means nothing. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner spread out before us. We can have it all anytime, and we do. Not the full of itself moon in the window, nor the crazed frost glittered on the sidewalk, nor the lamb white light humming in the ceiling are more radiant and necessary than she.
Windows, loved one, night sky, stars. This is the title poem for my book. If not these things. Peering into a mountain cabin, you salute the window like a scout, spying trout cushions and carved bar stools. Safe on this vacant deck, the two of you spoon in a chaise, gazing down at a windless denim lake. After dark, you drift the campground loops while small fires whisper and wink. stars have sugared the sky, and you could pour your voices into a crystal flute and drink. You pass the tent for now, touch-stepping the dark to an empty site and table. Nothing has ever seemed so close, not the bright city of stars, nor the black intaglio of trees, not legs wreathed with yours, nor a face warm in your palms. And if not these things, then what is one day in all your life?
Yeah, so that ends this portion of our program. I think we were going to throw it open for questions.
Yes.
If there are any.
Nobody from the at-home audience yet, so you're at the start.
Okay.
If not, we're just going to read more poems. So.
Protect yourself. Yeah.
Can both of you talk a little bit about your process? You know, do you write every day? Do you write when it comes to you? What's your process?
What's your process?
I'm looking for it, yes. I wish I could say that I wrote every day. I do not. I think about writing every day. I wish I had written every day. I abuse myself for not writing every day. You know, that's just part of the routine of being a writer, I guess. The world interferes with your routine, and I've been through many iterations of, you know, the writer, adamant journaling, you know, adamant diarying, adamant note taking. None of it sticks forever because too many things interfere. But basically, it's pen to paper. I like pen, I like paper. Everything starts that way. That may be more inducive to a poet than a prose writer, but that's fine. It has to go through several drafts before it gets into the computer as a workable, editable draft. I always begin with something that I've noticed, something that I've observed. I love looking for the wry, the ironic, the juxtaposition. A lot of poems begin with those things. I'm quick to notice things of surprise or wonder. He has a whole book called Wonder, Some Wonders. So that's another commonality, I think, that we have. Poems start out rough, they start out crude, then they slowly sometimes get better. You have to write badly to get to bad, to get to better. It's in that part that I discover the figures that I want, the figures of speech, and the language, the voice for that particular poem. And at that point now, through several or many drafts, I'm looking, what are the sounds? What are the images that will really make this work? What is the precise word and diction that you need in this particular case, and not just the second cousin, that sort of thing. So I'm a big believer in the dictionary and the thesaurus. So accuracy and precision are important to me. I never could, well, let me just say, I was never particularly polite to the students in my classes who said, I just wrote this morning, it's great. I mean, really? We'll see, but.
Yeah, what he said. Particularly, you know, wanting to write every day, but not writing every day, but fairly often. Really, the only thing that I would add to what Ken said, because my process is very similar, is that I take a long walk with my dog in the morning. And a lot of what I end up writing later in the day, or it goes into the journal that sometimes then evolves, happens in my head when I'm walking. And so I think that walking is an amazing inspiration. So, and I never know where those things come from. They just seem to pop in my head. And then I come home and I write them down. then I just put them in the journal, and sometimes I keep working on them, and sometimes they just stay in the journal for a long time. Sometimes they never leave the journal. Yeah, how it works for me. I will say one question, and Ken and I have talked about this, is, how do you know when a poem is finished? When you're done with the poem? And that's a tough one. But I was watching an interview with a poet named Mary Ruffin. It's a really wonderful poem. And she was asked that question, how do you know when the poem is finished? And she said, I know it's finished when it stops bothering me. And I thought, that's perfect. That's exactly right. It's just sort of, we come back and worry the poem. And then finally, you just can't worry it anymore. It doesn't mean it's great, but it means, it has stopped chasing you down. That sounds about right. So that's my answer now.
Who is it that wrote good poems are never finished but abandoned?
And yeah,
You just move on at some point. And we don't either one. I think we discovered this, that even published doesn't mean finished. We're still working on them after the case. In the case of my book, there were 2 previous chapbooks some 20 years back, and several of those poems came forward into this selected poems, but they all got tweaked. They all got worked on again. It's hard to ever settle for something that you wrote 20 years ago when you can look at it with whole new eyes.
yeah, and I do that as well. Are we near the end?
No, we're just gonna, that's another question, but
Oh.
please finish what you're going to say. I derailed the train.
Yeah, sorry, it just went right out of my head.
What's your question?
Well, ask the question, maybe we'll come back. So,
Okay.
but it picks up where you just left off, which is how do you decide what ends up in the collection that we get to pick up off the shelves?
How do we decide what ends up in the collection that ends up on the shelves? Take it away.
Well, I hate to say this, but it has a lot to do with which poems get published in magazines. And many times a poem that I'm only, moderately fond of myself, if I send it to a magazine and it gets accepted, I suddenly think it's a really good poem. Very odd. But so the poems that get published generally go into the manuscript that turns into the book. And beyond that, I don't know, it's just the poems that feel like they're finished. They feel like they've achieved the level of complexity I want them to have, that the language is where I want it to be. I just feel like it's as good as I can make it right now. But that doesn't always stay as good. Even when I was reading just now, I was changing words as I was reading the poem. So I'm a terrible reviser, or terrible in the sense that I never stop revising. W.H. Auden was sort of famous for revising constantly. And there's a famous story about somebody coming up to him at a reading and asking him to sign their book. And he said, sure. But then he turned to a page in the book where a poem was, and he crossed out a line and he wrote in a new line. Here. You
Haven't done that. The first chapbook I published was a collection of lyric poems, a lot of forms. And the second one was a book of narrative poems, mostly stories. And some of those have made it into this collection, but there's like 22 years of intervening material that weren't in either one of those. When I first started putting this book together, I was grouping them according to their commonalities, like their themes or subject matters or tones and so forth, like poems that were sort of humorous or light, poems that were serious and dark, and poems that were relationships and that sort of thing, because they were just naturally drawn to each other. They were never written with that intent, of course. So when I sent it off, the first editor who looked at it went, "These are really nice. It's like 4 chapbooks." And that's not what you want to hear from an editor when you're trying to do a whole book. You read what seems to be 4 distinct but not coherent books working together. So he was right. So I had to think about it and decide that, well, you know, life doesn't group itself that way. It does not categorize itself that way. You don't have a whole bunch of funny days and then a whole bunch of terrible days. And then, you know, it's all woven together. It's braided. So when I sat down with the manuscript one weekend, I thought, well, that's probably what I need to do with this. I need to have it move back and forth and interweave. And so I took it up with the idea that the poems would lead, that each poem would lead me to the next poem. Keeping the connection and the grouping and the categorization that I had done before, I looked for an image or a line or a word that would propel me toward the next poem. So there was always a resonance between the poem after the previous poem. And that worked. That I just found that to be a method that got me all the way to the end with the general drift of toward positivity and toward hope, the way we set this up and that books do. And I mean, you don't want books to be a negative experience. I mean, poetry's hard enough to sell anyway, right? Nobody wants downers, you know, or to end on the slope or the precipice, as opposed. So that's how this book got together. So I owe a grateful debt to that editor that told me that, but he didn't ask to see a second revision, so I didn't send him one. So somebody else got the book. Yes, sir.
Well, one of the things I'm enjoying so much about your poetry is just the level of awareness and observation that it feels to me like you go through part of your life, maybe all of your life. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
What is your favorite thing about being a poet?
Oh, the money.
Yeah.
I really think the favorite, really serious answer is that it gives my life purpose. You know, something. You know, I never take a vacation from writing poetry or being a poet. You know, sort of want to take a vacation from many other things, but I never want to take a vacation from being a poet. So that really is the most important part about it for me.
I had a career in teaching language, literature, and creative writing, which started way back when I was an undergraduate, actually, due to good teachers. And I just felt that if you're going to teach literature, if you're going to appreciate what, you know, the masters and things have done, then maybe you owe it to put something back out there, because without writing, there is no literature, right? I mean, it always puzzled me that creative writing departments and literature departments were always at each other's throats. It's like, duh, do you know where one comes from and how the other, but that seems to be the way that they work sometimes. But yeah, there are different ways to leave legacy, and words is one.
I have a question for the actual audience.
Yeah.
We'll go back to the in-store audience.
Great.
Emails, and starts with a compliment. Both of you read your work with nuance and drama. I'd say also with a little comedy though, right?
Yeah.
The sounds give the poems meaning they don't have just on a printed page. Where and how did you learn to read your work aloud? And how has this process changed for you over the years? And if one of you would mind repeating a synopsis of that in case the at-home audience.
The question was, how did we learn to read well out loud, and how did that process evolve?
I've been reading my poems out loud for a long time, you know, probably 45 years or so. So I think just practice, I got better at it. Stephanie has been to about as many of my readings as I have. And she gives me a little post-reading analysis and tells me, like, you're swallowing the ending. And so she's really helped me quite a bit, just sort of refining the reading. And I do practice. Stephanie was saying for this reading, she's saying, you're spending a lot of time practicing for this reading. And I do. I feel like if I'm going to give a reading, I should try to do it as well as I can. So I practice, and when I feel like it's okay, and feel like I'm ready to give the reading, there's a thing on your computer that you can read and then play it back and hear yourself. So I use that a fair amount to hear what it sounds like. And once I get past that hatred of your own voice, then I listen to it a little more objectively.
Well, I practice as well. As I said, I had 40 years of reading quotes and poems and things to students. And if you want to kill a class, the worst thing you can do is to stand up and read something poorly. So you better read it well with some enthusiasm and some, interest. And there's a lot of things to be heard in the vocalization of a poem that aren't on the page. And people who aren't used to reading poetry or hearing poetry can totally miss that. So it was helpful for the students to hear a voice that knew inflection and nuance and things like that to read a poem. And so that experience of reading others' poems many, 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 many more times than I've ever read my own helped. Another thing is that I've been to a lot of poetry readings and seen poetry read so badly that I would just go, I'm never going to do that to an audience. I'm never going to hold the paper in front of my page. I'm never going to pick the poems that I want to read as the reading is occurring, that sort of thing. I'm not going to mumble and be, monotone. My wife would testify that that's one of the things that I'll come out about after a reading is hearing somebody that basically does not respect the audience, to project, be clear, have some interest in their voice. If you want to read it, read it. If you don't want to read it, then what are you doing here?
Calm down, Ken. Yeah.
I'm curious about your childhood. If you were interested in writing as a kid, and how long you've been writing, and when you started thinking of yourself as a writer.
Good one. So the question is basically, how did we become poets and develop poets, and what was our childhood like? I had a very kind of Ozzie and Harriet childhood. I didn't have a difficult childhood at all, so I'm kind of amazed that I became a poet. It seems like difficulty seems to be one of the main sources of poetry. But I had a nice childhood. My mom was a reader, and she got me reading early on, and reading led to me writing. I think all kids write, right? So from there, I just kept writing, and I had a lot of teachers along the way who kept encouraging my writing. And as long as somebody's telling you you're doing something well, you're going to keep doing it, right? So yeah, I just kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. I don't know that I ever thought of myself as a poet until I started to get things published. When a magazine would accept a poem, when I got some external sort of validation, then I felt like, okay, maybe I am a poet.
Yeah, to follow up on what he said, my parents were both literate people. They had both been teachers at one time. Our house was full of books. They subscribed to several newspapers, magazines, and things like that. They were happy. They were married for 40-something years. They didn't drink. They didn't curse. They went to church 3 times a week. How was I going to be a novelist? There was no way. Or a memoirist. So it was pretty much left to writing poems, you know, about this little thing I see and that little thing I see. So I didn't really start writing poems until I was in college. And it was the encouragement of some professors who let me know I could write. I didn't know I could. But the experience of being around literate people as a child certainly helped put books and words in my head that I was able to then effuse at some point. As another part of that, I was reading poetry out loud way before I ever should have. I worked at a conference center in Black Mountain while I was still in college, and they had a talent show, and somebody said, why don't you read a few of your poems in the talent show? So I did. Then I got asked by the administration to read them to some of their visiting groups. So at some point I was 18, 19 years old, reading in front of 800 or 900 people, didn't have enough sense to be scared to death and just hope that they've forgotten all of what they heard at that point. But that was one of the ways I lost my fear of reading, because I was just put in front of a group and didn't know better.
Well, we're just past the top of the hour. And so I'd just like to wrap up by thanking you both for the beautiful readings.
Thank you.